Last week, the Department of Justice released a controversial memo. It authorizes states to send Americans with disabilities to institutions, nursing homes, psych wards, segregated schools, rather than funding the community-based services that allow them to remain at home. This would undo decades of community integration reforms, including longtime Supreme Court precedent that was designed to allow those with disabilities to live independent, productive lives. This week, we learned that White House Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller was behind that memo, according to Bloomberg Law, who spoke to people who were briefed. And while spokespeople for both the White House and the DOJ denied that Miller played a role in the memo, this attempt to remove folks with disabilities from their communities tracks with his exclusionary vision for this country. Miller is infamously obsessed with demographics, crowing just today about deporting Haitian migrants and refugees. Under his watch, DHS has produced a trove of state propaganda, which experts say promotes white nationalist slogans and iconography. He is also, of course, the architect of Trump's draconian immigration policies. And as the New York Times reports, during a private meeting during the last presidential campaign, Trump reportedly told staff that Miller wants to deport more than 2/3 of this country's population, leaving behind only those who look like him. For its part, the White House denies that reporting, but it certainly seems consistent with an ethos that says, if you can't deport your undesirables, at least hide them away. Allison Barkoff led disability enforcement work at the Department of Justice. She is currently the director of the Hirsch Health Law and Policy Program at George Washington University, and she joins me now. Allison, walk us through what this memo would mean in practice.
So this memo is shocking in its reversal of 50 years of policy by the United States government that states should provide services to people with disabilities in their own homes and in their own communities instead of locking them away in institutions, hiding them away from society. And what this means in this reversal is that the main enforcer of disability rights laws has now said, we are not going to continue with that work. That's going to mean settlement agreements being undone, new positions in court, and the memo talks about undoing decades-long regulations that have been in place.
So why have there been these regulations that mandate community integration where possible? What are the benefits of that for the individuals who are affected, for economic outcomes? Why has this been such an important fight for the disability community?
The disability rights laws and these integration mandate regulations come from a very ugly history in our country when people with disabilities were segregated away in institutions. RFK's own father went and visited one of these infamous institutions in New York, calling it a snake pit. And that is what led to really a push to create community services. The vast majority of people can and want to live in the community. It's cost effective and it leads to better outcomes. Think about it. It is community services that allow families to keep children with disabilities in their own homes. It's what allows children to go to school with their peers in their neighborhood. Because of these community services, we have disabled coworkers. We have people with disabilities that are part of all of our community. And that's why these laws are so critical. And people in the disability community have fought for decades. These are hard-won rights that are at risk with this memo.
This is also not the first time that this administration has gone after Americans with disabilities in some way. HHS floated an autism registry. RFK Jr. has made repeated ugly comments about Americans on the autism spectrum never being able to lead productive lives. You have the president and his top civil rights official using a slur for people with intellectual disabilities. Can you put this decision in the broader context of the administration's approach to this community?
It's been a pretty astounding last year for people with disabilities. Just in the same week as the Department of Justice memo came out, the Trump administration announced moving all of the programs that support students with disabilities out of the Department of Education into the Department of Health and Human Services, segregating programs for students with disabilities from programs for students without disabilities. This is on top of a $1 trillion cut to the Medicaid program, which funds the very services that we're talking about that help people live in their own homes and in their own communities. And so people with disabilities are now across the country navigating threats and cuts to the very services that help them stay in their own homes and in their own communities. The president's budget proposes eliminating very important programs that support people with disabilities and their families. And that is just a handful of the long list of policies that are incredibly harmful to people with disabilities and their families.
In the brief time that we have left, I want to drill down on something you said earlier about it being cost effective for people to get these services while they are still living in their own homes. You have been tracking the huge cuts to home and community-based services that states have been undergoing in an effort to save money because the One Big Beautiful Bill cut Medicaid spending. Why are states doing this? Won't it cost them more money in the end if they kick people off of these programs and ultimately have to institutionalize a larger share of the population?
Well, it is true that it is cost effective. We can serve 3 people for every 1 person in an institution. The reason states are cutting these important community services is they know people will do anything to stay out of institutions. We are already starting to see with the states, almost half of states already starting to cut services in response to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, H.R. 1. And we are seeing people trying to find ways to manage, families having to leave their jobs to fill in and provide those services and supports. We see people who will do anything not to go into a nursing home, people who are making choices about maybe I won't get a shower this week, maybe I won't be able to get out of bed, people who are willing to even die in their own homes to avoid going into an institution. It is an existential threat for the disability community right now.
Alison Barkoff, thanks so much for your time tonight.